So hello everybody and welcome to this afternoon session. My name's Ruth Puttick, and over the next 45 minutes or so we're going to be talking about the politics of labs. I should say I feel a little bit like I'm in Destiny's Child, sat on the stool, but I'll try not to burst into song. And we're joined by a stellar lineup of real leaders in the field of innovation from both within the government system and outside. We have Arlene Foster, who is a minister within the Northern Ireland government and who has recently inherited a lab. And Arlene deserves huge kudos because not only has she battled the tube strike today, she's also technically on holiday. So I think this is a real commitment to innovation. We also have Professor Stephen Goldsmith, who has had a wide-ranging career, serving as the Mayor of Indianapolis, Deputy Mayor in New York, and is currently at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Next up is Marco Steinberg, who was at the Helsinki Design Lab at Citra for a number of years and has since founded Haystack and Snowcone, a strategic design agency. And last but by no means least is Chris Sigaloff from Kennisland, which is a fascinating think tank based in the Netherlands, which is both a lab in and of itself and also advises others on how to create labs as well. The session is going to run with, we're going to hear 5 minutes from each of the speakers in their reactions to this question. We're then going to have a panel Q&A, and hopefully if there's time at the end, we'll take a few questions. So if you have any thoughts or comments throughout, please do note those down and we'll try and pick those up at the end. So Arlene, if you'd like to kick us off, please.
Okay, and if we're all Destiny's Child, I'm Beyonce, and it's good to be here. No, it is really good to be here with such a stellar cast today. I inherited finance and personnel, the department with responsibility for public sector reform in Northern Ireland on the 11th of May, a date etched into my mind, as my civil servants will tell you. I was the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Investment in Northern Ireland for 7 years, and that's quite a long tenure for public office, as you can imagine. But during that time, we were really trying to grapple with innovation because from the point of view of Northern Ireland, we were the 12th out of 12 regions in the United Kingdom in terms of how we were dealing with innovation. So there was a real need to bring about a more innovative way of doing things, not just in the private sector, but very much in the public sector as well. So of course we did what government does best and drew up a strategy to deal with innovation. But more importantly than that, we also set about putting in place some labs. And the first of those labs went live in June of last year. It dealt with a peculiar policy in Northern Ireland, regulatory impact assessments, which have to be carried out on all policies brought forward. And it was a very good engagement and brought forward, importantly for me, very good outputs for a red tape survey that was going on at that time. So it has worked well, and now we're engaged in around 20 labs of varying policy areas. Indeed, some look at technical issues, but they're all happening now in Northern Ireland. And for me, that's very pleasing because politicians certainly do not have all of the wisdom in terms of what is the best way to move forward in public sector reform. And it's good to bring people together in an environment where they can be more experimental in what they're putting forward, as opposed to the strictures that politicians find themselves in. So it has worked well for us in Northern Ireland. We believe it's a good way to bring forward policy and to bring forward new ideas, so much so that we've now brought in the OECD into Northern Ireland and asked them to look in at our policy areas and ask them whether we should be doing things differently as well, and we're looking forward to those reports later on in the year. Political sponsorship of the lab, hugely important as far as I am concerned, because whilst people come into the lab and bring new ideas forward, unless there's the political backing for taking those new ideas forward, then you will not get the buy-in from the rest of the ecosystem in politics, and that's why having political buy-in is so critically important. And I'm going to stop there, Ruth, and be a very good girl and finish early.
Good, thank you. Professor Goldsmith.
But I'm a long-time politician. I think I just heard you accuse me of not having a monopoly on innovation. Yeah. So this is disturbing. So let me just think about this quickly. You think about political sponsorship. Well, I was a mayor of a 12th largest city in the U.S. Back in the dark ages in the 90s, and set up one of these innovation units. And I was, as the political sponsor, I was convinced I was right at all times that we set the unit up correctly. And then I became deputy mayor for Mike Bloomberg, and I inherited a couple innovation delivery units, not called that at the time. One in charge of operations, one in charge of sustainability. And so then my sponsor was Mike Bloomberg, and I was kind of the advocate for the innovation delivery teams, not with that name, and now we kind of teach and write about it. So I've been at this and made dozens of mistakes over the last 3 decades, really, in this area. So let me just make a couple, maybe brief comments. One, so what you want from your innovation delivery unit, right, is disruption, but not mayhem. Right, so because the purpose, you're not doing any good if you're not disrupting the system. But if you disrupt the system too much, then obviously the chances of getting across the goal line are quite slim, and a number of other issues happen as well. And so I think that's relatively important. And in my experience, both for Mayor Mike and when I was a mayor, and what I'm doing at Harvard, right, is that the benefit of the innovation delivery team is it has peripheral vision across the verticals and into the for-profit marketplace, right? And you know, even in a relatively small city like Indianapolis, a little less than 1 million people, where I appointed the cabinet directors, within only months they became captive of the information flows inside their verticals. They're all loyal to me. They're all smart people. I appointed them, you know, but then their ability to think broadly slowly kind of slips away. So the innovation delivery team, when I mean disruptive, means it's able to think in a network fashion and across the verticals and shop good ideas. Second, I think in that regard is the following, and this is even more difficult, I think, in managing upward, which is that between the innovation delivery unit and the bottom, there are layers of managers who will be disrupted if you're successful, right? Because the folks at the bottom have really good ideas about how to do their work, and they're just not getting up to the top, which is why you're there. So how do you disrupt the system in a way that empowers them, right, and manage the noise level that comes in the middle managers? And I have lots of examples about that, but that's point 2. Point 3 is the following. You can't stay at this for a long time without really good benchmarks. That means, okay, I'm going to touch this thing and I'm going to break it and I'm going to fix it, which means I'm going to publicize the benchmarks about quality, service level agreements, and price before I touch it and break it. And then when I fixed it again, I have new data, and I'm going to keep a scorecard. Dollars saved, customers improved, services. And without the pre and post, then the advocates will always have a heyday, because you're all, I mean, I used to put up on my wall this Machiavelli phrase, which we don't have time to kind of say, but I'll paraphrase it basically, which is the people who are against you are really against you, and the people who are for you don't even know who they are yet, right? Because the benefits are inchoate. So that's it. That's an important issue too. And then lastly, I think it's worth mentioning that, you know, the management issues are all pretty simple. I mean, really, you know, somebody will tell you the management. What's difficult is the framing and the stakeholder management, right? And if the innovation delivery team doesn't own that explicitly, they cannot be successful. And framing means kind of what's the big frame. So when we did 80 managed competitions and privatizations in Indianapolis, right? The frame was building better neighborhoods, because we took the proceeds from the competitions and invested in better neighborhoods. If I would have said to the public or my innovation unit, follow me, we're going to kind of disruptively compete every public service, they'd go, I'm not interested in that, right? I'm interested in higher quality service. And so how do you do the framing? And when you do the framing, and this is a kind of the last subpart of this, right? I think the most successful leaders of the innovation delivery teams who are managing their politics up are those who bring in stakeholders who don't really know that they're stakeholders. For example, you know, I've been fighting with taxi cabs for now like 3 decades in Indianapolis and other cities in New York City. And in the Indianapolis example, in fighting the taxi cartel, we went out and found an invaluable ally. And that invaluable ally was the preeminent leading minority advocacy group in Indianapolis. Why? Because their citizens weren't getting good help in their neighborhoods. Their small businesses couldn't get taxi cartel licenses. And so the framing and the stakeholder management means managing up, means you help your boss because you identify stakeholders and you energize the stakeholders, you bring them to the game in support of the changes. At the same time, you're mitigating the disruption that you're doing. When you handle those things, the politics are great, because the mayor gets to cut the ribbon and claim that it was his or her idea in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marco.
Yes, I think it was very interesting hearing the conversations we had up to now, and I think the political undertones were coming up, meaning that people were becoming quite aware in the conversations about the political dimension of this. I think we heard things like movements. And I'll just put out there that I think innovation, as we probably commonly share, will always invariably be political, but not party politics. And I think that's a big distinction. Political in the sense that you're ultimately ideologically driven, you're ultimately thinking about what makes a better society, and you're doing the job of politicians to some degree. Right? I'll come to this in a second. But it's not party politics. And I'll speak from the narrow perspective of Finland, where I come from. So some of these things may or may not apply. So I think one of the challenges is also thinking about the political system, the legacy of parties that we have, that emerged out of a very coherent point in time where there's a need for a national transformation to occur, which is basically going from a rural agricultural economy to urban industrial economy. And so then we had the Farmers' Party, we had the Workers' Party, and we had the Business Owners' Party. And that made sense back then. But we don't have that same transformation going on between agriculture and cities anymore, yet we're trying to use those political parties to create political change. So this complicates it. I don't think the way is to create new political parties. It's just too complicated, but that we need to also disrupt political parties. And a lot of the innovation work is actually to talk pre-elections and post-elections with all parties and give them tools to do better politics. I think the second thing to keep in mind is that we talk about innovation. I actually don't know if that's a very helpful term. I agree with some of the comments before. When you put labs in, one of the dangers is, here come the smart people, you've been doing a lousy job. And I see this from permanent secretaries in Finland, the sheer fear on their eyes, because they're thinking about how to manage an organization and not actually bring tensions in. So I think the objectives are right, but the terminology may actually be more loaded than we actually think. Now, I think the big challenge is the way that the system's set up. And I'll oversimplify this, and I'm sure many will disagree with me. But politicians are fundamentally about creating a vision about a better tomorrow. That's where tomorrow is. And the public servants are basically there to bring the technical skills to get us there. And that divide is what most of the innovation practices are challenging. And when you co-create with citizens, you're creating political movements, you're building ideological views about the world, you're technically solving them, and you're kind of short-circuiting this. And I think one needs to be very aware of that. This idea that we plan everything and then we implement it, we're talking about prototyping and iterating quickly. It gets us into even technical challenges like public procurement. What happens when you hit 30,000 K in Europe? Do you stop and bring a legal team and wait 6 months to do the big bid? Or do you start every little experiment as potentially the next big solution that will save humankind and procure it for billions of euros? Right? So there's all kinds of issues that really fundamentally were challenging the system. And I think we need to make that realized. I think because of the nature of central government and the difference between central government and municipalities, I think municipalities tend to be more comfortable with the word of innovation because they have to not just deal with the regulatory environment, but they have to take the trash out. They're more used to maybe doing the thinking and the doing. And so I think we're seeing more political pull at that level. And I think we have a lot of barriers. In Finland, at least, it's politically thought of not being sanitary to talk to public servants. And there's a firewall because that should not be tainted by the beliefs of public servants. In some places, like city planning, that firewall is very big. The same happens between central government and municipalities. Municipalities get very irritated if we're going to try to connect something of policy all the way down to how you take your trash out. And yet that's where the innovation is going to happen. Couple of things I just want to leave you with. One is this notion that crisis is the mother of invention. I think in Europe we're finding out that you actually are less smart in front of a crisis, not smarter. And so I think we need to have the political aptitude to actually get politicians to react before crises hit, not wait for crises to happen. I think we also need to show what the process is. So you can't assume to drop a team in without that ecosystem having realized that things need to happen differently. In Finland, we worked with the city of Lahti to work around master planning, About 1,200 master plans a year are done in Finland. 9% go to court. That means an automatic 2-year delay on this, which means private money is going to run away because they don't like insecurity. And if courts allow the public planning to go ahead, you're probably seeding resentment, which will come up in some other kind of obstruction, whether you're doing health next time or some other kind of reform. So I think part of this is also how you change the debate. It's not about public planning. It may be actually about creating social stability. It's not necessarily about the environment, but decarbonizing is not about the environment, but it's actually about national security and finding the right political angle to drive the same agenda forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Chris, over to you.
I agree with a lot what you say. I think for us, one of my experiences, and we've been talking about that, is that labs or innovation teams, or however if you want to call them, are often they have the same fault as what happens if you start up an innovation group within a company. So especially for governments, if governments set up an innovation lab or an innovation team, it often feels like window dressing. It feels like an excuse, like, look how innovative, we're busy. And a lot of times it's also, you can innovate, but within the boundaries that we say. So actually it's often very much in the box, and we're not really allowed to talk about different values or different futures. It's the future. It's often about implementation. How do we deliver things in a more effective way instead of really thinking about a real future? And I just had a personal experience last week. Just to tell you, we are running what we call a social lab in the city of Dordrecht, which is near Rotterdam in the south of Holland. And it's set up by the chief executive. It has the support of 3 aldermen. It has all the directors. And they said, Kennisland, please help us set up a social lab. And it's about youngsters and talents and work. And so we worked there for 6 weeks running this social lab. We actually participated with the young people, with the public servants. And they said, please come and brief us now what you've been doing. And we were part of like a 3-hour session with all the directors, and we had an hour in the beginning. And I was really like, okay, here we go. We've been working. We have really great results. We have some tremendous perspectives like this. They're really going to have to hear this. And so actually the session went really well. They were listening and they were like, it's terrible. We're losing so much money. Our services are not effective. We're doing it in the wrong way. And then after the end of the hour, they said, thank you so much for all this experience. By the way, we have now a crisis within our own municipal. We need to go on with business. Thank you, Mrs. Sigaloff. There's the door, and now we go on. And I called later and I said, so did we have any impact? Did they listen to our lessons? And they were like, no, they really loved it. But then, it was business as usual. And so, of course, I was thinking we really did a bad job in designing this, but something is going wrong. It's like we use the lab, we're actually paying money to do it, but we're not taking up the lessons and seeing it as part of our real work. So it's often they have to change, but not we have to change. And Kennisland, being an independent organization outside of government, I was thinking, what have been the strategies for us to gain political support? Because, of course, So one, of course, is the one that most of all have used is try to find your ambassador. So you try to find the person who gives you political support, who's high up, who will say, I'll make this possible for you, I'll do the funding. This can be a great strategy until that person loses power, drops, dead, goes away, and then you're lost and you have this innovation center and no supporter anymore. So we've done this strategy, we still do it, but it doesn't always work. The second strategy is kind of what we call the horse of Troy, where we make it sound very simple and not a threat at all. So we said, it's just a very small innovation process, it won't really harm you. But then you try to build in that, the army comes out and it becomes really quite powerful, and suddenly the mayor or the chief executive is like, oh my God, did I actually say yes to this project? And now I have to deal with it. And so it becomes political. And the third strategy, I'm not really sure this is a feasible one, but it's one that's in my mind, is that it's like perhaps stay away from political power altogether. So one of the experiences has been that we've been running labs with teachers. And until now, there was no political support for this, and also no government support. But we just went on with these teachers. And now what happened is actually a whole movement started, and the teachers are saying, we want to go on with this. And actually now the government is interested, but now you feel if they are going to grab it, they might ruin it. So the third strategy could also be stay away, create a movement from the bottom, and not look for the political support, and just try to make it a movement from down below. So these are the three strategies. I don't know which is wise, but we are trying out. And I do think that if we talk about labs or innovation teams, one thing to really think in advance is how do you design the political process? So how do you design in advance how you can get the support, how not only the support, but how the whole governmental system is willing to change as well. So can you build in elements that it will have to go talk about values, that it will have to be something that is also a new way of doing policy making, that is also a new way of how we view research. And if these elements are not part of the lab, it's going to be nice margin. What did Charlie say were at the end there of the green arrow? Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Lots of food for thought. I think we probably need a lot longer than 40 minutes, whatever it is we have left now. One of the things that came out for me very strongly from all of what you said and from the sessions earlier as well is this nature of a group of different range of stakeholders. So we heard it in the session this morning that a lab's becoming more of a social movement and they're engaging with citizens. And each of you said that political power is important at different stages of a lab's life stage. I'm interested to hear from you as well who else you think within government and elsewhere, outside as well, are the kind of influence makers, the change makers, the people that can help a lab have impact or equally can block it. Because I've been struck as well from a lot of the sessions that citizens have been lacking from some of these conversations today. Are they a key part in it? What are your reflections on who the kind of main stakeholders are in ensuring a lab has impact?
Well, in terms of, I mean, I've been fascinated to hear what has been said and the talk of boundaries and having to work within a boundary of these awful politicians and what have you. But the reality is, if we have a democracy where people vote people into positions of authority, then I would suggest that you do have to work with the politicians that are in those positions to give it legitimacy to move an issue forward. And the way to do that is to take Marco's point around co-design and to involve citizens in policy development. And I think that's the critical piece. And one of the very good ways I've seen that in practice has actually been the work of the Prince's Regeneration Trust in Northern Ireland, where they actually bring a whole village into a design model for what their vision is for the future, as well as stakeholders from planning, service and government and all the rest of it. So they actually bring those people all together and then they design the village for the future as to what every stakeholder sees in that village. And that has worked particularly well, and there's a very good example of it in Northern Ireland, in Glenarm, in a village in Northern Ireland. So it is really important to recognise the bits that you cannot change and the bits that you can change. And of course, the part that I don't think anybody here doesn't want to have a democracy. I think we all do want to have a democracy, but it's how we enable change in that democracy. And to do that, I think the labs are a critical point in encouraging the citizens to see different outputs for them. Not top down, not bottom up, but actually working together in the centre, using politicians and citizens as well.
Great. Thank you. And Marco, you were going to...
Yeah, no, I was going to say, one thing we haven't really talked about, we've all assumed that public sector innovation teams happen within sort of political mandates. I used to work for the Finnish Innovation Fund, which is a politically independent and financially independent branch of government that reports directly to government. So I think one of the questions is sort of what are the meta tools for governments to reinvent themselves? The promise of that model is that you can look longer term and grab problems that go beyond traditional boundaries. When I work in the ministries, I'm going to create a caricature, so forgive me, but just to exaggerate, there may be little political interest in spending a lot of effort in one department when the benefits happen in another department, right? So from a political perspective. So you can be politically independent and financially independent, and the rules are very, very different. Then we're talking more about, on the one hand, in organizational politics. And in our case, what I realized, because the chairman of the board of our organization was the permanent secretary of the finance ministry, to be very attuned to the political temperature of that. And let me just end on a note that shifts it from a question of leadership or politics to, I think at the end, a kind of existential question. So I ran a large project. It was a 30 million euro investment in real estate that was intended to change the marketplace to a real estate development in Finland to be zero carbon. 4 years in, we spent about 2 million. The board decided to divest from the project. And I think I realized too late that the question was a self-existential question. The question of innovation challenged the beliefs and the culture, the success track record of the past in very fundamental ways. And we were basically asking the board to sign off on a very different kind of investment logic. And these were some of the best brains in Finland, where investors were looking to as being upholding the golden standard. And now they were going to be asked to believe in a very different system. So I think this kind of existential challenge that it poses is very difficult. So yes, political, but more importantly, human, is really understand what drives that person.
And a slightly different tack now, but I'm keen to hear from you, Professor Goldsmith, on how labs can be sustained beyond a change in political leadership. You obviously set some up when you were a mayor yourself and were involved in a number under Mayor Bloomberg, and they've survived. A number of those have survived in New York. Are there any key components of those labs, what they've done, their behaviours, their interaction with political sponsors, or indeed interactions with others, which has helped to sustain them?
Yeah, I have mixed views about this, right? It feels a little inconsistent to say, I'm all about innovation, I want change, but when I leave, I don't want it to change, right? So the message is a little bit inconsistent. I think another way to, and so, obviously the philosophies of Bloomberg and de Blasio are quite different. So the innovation tools are still there, although the politics of how and for what purposes those tools are used have changed, as they should. It's a democracy, and they chose a different kind of philosophical path. Another way to answer the question is, can one unlock can one change the culture and unlock innovation more broadly in an enterprise so that it can't be put back in the bottle once that is unleashed, right? I saw our labor unions go from very prescriptive, rigid, rule-driven organizations to problem-solving organizations that wanted to prove how good they were. You could not put them back in that bottle. They would not go back there after that changed. The same would be true of kind of other processes that unlock value in the enterprise. So I'm not so caught up in the preservation of the institution of the lab itself, but the culture of innovation unleashed by the lab, and hopefully then the lab stays around in some form or another.
Great.
Perhaps it's actually a good sign if the lab is not necessary anymore. So perhaps in itself, per definition, these are temporary spaces that are needed to, kind of put a bit of power into it and catalyze. But it shouldn't be a new institution.
So let me go ahead. No, sorry.
No, I've just noticed a lot of times, also setting up these labs in cities, before you know, you are organization X in the whole range of organizations that's already doing something. So I think that's also one of the questions. How can you create a catalyzing power which doesn't start functioning as a normal organization?
Yeah, I think that's it. And can you think of any examples of where that's happened, where a lab has been created or a network of innovation institutions have been created, they've gone, but an innovation culture has remained? Or are we still at too early a stage in government innovation for that to have happened yet?
Well, maybe this is responsive. I think it is. So, when Mike Bloomberg did his first long-term sustainability plan and created a team in City Hall to do that. Now, no one called that an innovation team, but it really was an innovation team around sustainability. And it was early enough that sustainability wasn't quite as faddish as it is today. And that powered innovation across the departments, right? So innovation in sustainability. So how you build the bridge, how you design the park, how you do X, right? And so I think that's to the point that was just made. Then that becomes the part of the culture of the organization, regardless of whether it stays as a long-term sustainability innovation unit or not.
And also, I mean, if you look at the Northern Ireland example, we are looking at particular issues. So you don't have the same stakeholders involved in the labs on every occasion. In fact, by definition, there will be different people in every lab, and they'll all have their different dynamic as to how they move forward in terms of innovation.
I wanted to be a bit of a devil's advocate because I agree completely with the kind of culture change that can happen, and you can't put it back in the bottle. Absolutely, and I think that's very important. I think it creates a good base, a kind of fertile environment for new peaks to emerge. But I think you also need to resource new kinds of competencies into the organization. I think one of the big flaws is to assume that the same people that were hired to do a very different job suddenly can build an airplane. No, they're maybe good as a football team, right? And you can make them more creative in football, but they may not have the professional skills need to build an airplane, right? But they can help support new team members that come in that bring those new skills in. So to be a bit of a pessimist, just to kind of push some buttons maybe, I was working, we mentioned this a little bit, but when we were talking, but I worked for the PM's office to try to shape an idea about how you bring some of that in. And I went to a meeting with secretaries of state in the room, and everybody could understand that this is what needs to happen as long as a decision wasn't made and no new resources was allocated, right? So there's somehow this great contradiction. There's a great desire and intellectual understanding that change needs to happen, but there isn't really, and I think it goes back to the kind of existential fear to step out and say we're going to actually put resources, especially in a moment where resources are being cut from elderly services and so on. And I think we need to figure out the conundrum, how do we fix that conundrum somehow?
Can I just add one thing to that? Because I do also think that the whole way the labs are financed is quite a problem or a dilemma. So if the lab is not only to kind of optimize how government is working, but it's really geared towards real change and actually creating better outcomes for people, it could very well be that some of the outcomes of these labs are about, making some organizations really redundant. I mean, in a lot of the work that we've been doing, one of the things that we found out was that often, in the field of childcare, for example, there are 4 organizations and 3 of them could close down and it would create better outcomes. Well, how can a lab that is actually being financed by the system then come up with these things? And every time you feel, once you get into that process, you get into a very painful spot. And so the whole idea of how do we finance these things, how is the ownership being organized? If we say that government needs to change itself, but needs to change from the outside in as well, how do do we really take that seriously?
So if I can, sorry, just very quickly, when you talk about money, in Finland, it's become very popular to say that we're doing a lot of innovation. When you press people on it, there's actually very little money. It's money that's being allocated to do the same stuff, to supplement and so on, but it's being shaped kind of differently. So I don't know how, at least in Finland, we're going to get some money and a mandate to say we need to bring new resources in.
Okay. And I just want to go back to what you were saying, Chris, as well about making those tough decisions. And it would be interesting to hear from the panel on what are the leadership qualities that are needed in order to make those tough decisions. What's the role of the political sponsor in that, and how can the lab engage with them effectively to make that happen?
Well, it's just interesting when we talk about closing down pieces, because we have a public policy at the moment called Transforming Your Care in terms of the health service, and it is all about how do we deal with the fact that we have an ageing population, that we have to deal with things differently, use new technology, and of course from one sector of the community, it is seen to be a cost-cutting exercise, and it's not looking for innovation. So if you suggest closing down a hospital, if you suggest doing things differently, it is characterised as cost-cutting as opposed to innovation and doing things differently. So there's always that tension for politicians that we're really only interested in cutting cost as opposed to innovating and doing things differently. And that's a real live tension in Northern Ireland at the moment. And that really calls for leadership from the politicians to say, actually, your health service would be better if you put all of your cardiac care in one place as opposed to having it in 3 places. And so that's a real challenge for politicians, because not many politicians go to the closure of a hospital, to be blunt. We'll go to the opening of a hospital, but we don't go to the closing. So it is important to give political leadership, and that's just a live example going on at the moment.
That's great.
Well, you have part of the difficulty with the conversation in a short period of time, right, is that you have policy innovation, you have operational innovation. We're talking about a number of different things in a short period of time. So if you ask what the role is of a leader, a little bit depends on kind of which of those categories. So one role of a leader might be to set up the structures that whether they're innovation delivery team units or changes in structures the way government operates, right? Revolving funds, performance pay, and the like that help the innovation unit innovate because they're changing the underlying structures of government. That's one form of leadership. Another form of leadership says, look, I'll slightly off subject for a second. About 2 years ago, I was having lunch with a well-known U.S. mayor who said, my approval ratings are now 70%. And to which I wanted to say, they're too high. You want your approval ratings to be 55%, because you now got embedded political capital you're not using for change, right? So use it, right? So another definition of leadership is when the leader has aspirational goals, right, around which resources get committed, around which underperforming resources get repurposed, right, and is willing to fight that battle. Now, we all would say, obviously, and support the people who he or she then sets out into the front lines, and if they make a mistake, whatever, kind of supports them. So I think you have the kind of political leadership on the aspirational side and framing the issues, and then you've got the operational stuff as well. And lastly, I think going back to I think the comments about money were important, because it seems to me that, the really out there innovation can be funded by a foundation. Like most of the ridiculous things I did were funded by non-public dollars because they were not they might not succeed, right? So nobody wanted to appropriate money for them. I don't mean ridiculous and illiterate, but I mean kind of out there, right? So I forgot. I'm so old that I forgot everything you say gets tape recorded and gets repeated. So I didn't really mean ridiculous. I meant kind of like out there innovation. But the other issue is that one needs to create funding streams so that these innovation delivery teams can be self-sustaining, right? And they're not dependent on the funds from the programs they're trying to cut. So I think another definition of leadership is the financial support that can be organized to support the teams going forward.
One thing I wanted to say about this political question, I mean, I think, and maybe even the tone of some of our remarks may suggest that the flaws are in the politicians, is actually to reverse that. Because I think we have very capable leaders, is the expectations we have as citizens towards them. And I think sometimes they're kind of untenable. So if we're going to talk that innovation is an iterative, exploratory, experimental, co-creative process, are we okay with politicians saying, I don't really know where this is going to go, and we may have to back out of a particular process as we realize that that's not working, right? Then we're going to hold them accountable. Well, they lied, and they don't know what they're talking about, and so on. And so I think there's a real gap there in terms of what are our expectations towards politicians. I think that needs to change too.
Okay, great, thank you. I've just been told that we only have 5 minutes left. So before we close, I'm keen to hear each of your reflections to this question, but in particular, I really liked Professor Goldsmith's comment about not putting innovation back in its bottle once it's out there. And you all come from such diverse backgrounds and have a different perspective on this. So I would love to hear your one piece of advice to either a political leader or to an innovation lab, or just a general kind of rallying call to the world on how governments can get better at generating a culture of innovation that sustains and lasts. Or equally, if you could wave a magic wand, what you would change. Chris, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
No, I don't. Go ahead, someone else first.
Obviously, if labs are to work, they must have a credibility and an output. So I suppose my own advice, looking at what has happened in Northern Ireland, is to have some time where the lab can bed in, have credibility, and then if political leadership changes in that particular department, then the genie is out. You've had time to see the changes that have been made by the lab, and therefore innovation becomes part of government and becomes part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So I suppose having some time for innovation to bed in is very important, particularly for politicians.
So maybe not the way you intended it. The current advanced civil service system of westernized states is the enemy of innovation, right? They're rule-driven, prescriptive, job classifications, procurement systems that are designed to make sure that nobody has any discretion to exercise, right? And then we complain about red tape and bureaucracy. So if I was going to wave a wand, I would say we ought to rethink. Look, we're making government the way we made it in the U.S. 100 years ago, with a set of social and technical and dynamic and data tools that could unlock enormous satisfaction and empowerment on the part of employees, right? Employees who could listen more broadly to private and nonprofit providers, employees who could solve problems for citizens, employees could co-produce if they were allowed to. So my wand would say, take the lessons of the innovation delivery team, embed them throughout the bureaucracy, change the rules, and let's unleash true innovation that's governing by network across the sectors, and we can dramatically change the fulfillment and satisfaction of government.
I would say maybe two things. One goes back to this money question, and to figure out, and I think the onus is sort of on us, innovators, so to speak, is to shift the conversation from cost to investment. And when we're in the yearly budgetary cycle, it forces us to think within the existing kind of logic. So to shift it to an investment. And I think we need to get much better at making arguments why investing this kind of money in the long term will make good change. The second, which I'll give a compliment to our new Prime Minister, we have a new government. His first action was actually to bring all the ministers and all the permanent secretaries for 1 month in a single co-shared space, open floor plan, no one with offices. And the idea behind that was that if we can work the first month of government together without having to have too many meetings, talk across the table like we do when we're designing stuff, that will set us better off in the future. So I think one is the shift of how we think about resources to investment, and the second one is to create that culture of working together before we go back into our boxes.
Adding on that, perhaps I think it also has to do, and it sounds of course very easy, but it's kind of, which is very difficult, I would imagine, as a political leader, how you let go of control. But the whole dilemma of, if you hear the words of unleashing innovation and having it all, and how do we marry that with control? And also listening a bit to the morning. One thing that every time worries me when we get to these gatherings is that a lot of the language that we use, again, is what works, evidence-based, trial control. We need to implement it. There need to be new structures. We need to do it in a structured way. Let's take the models from the kind of science and put it on these things. And then I think, no, it's exactly the other way around. It's exactly seeking more control. It's seeking more ways of being able to dominate or to predict in advance what is going to come out. And I don't have the answer, but how could you actually dare to take step forwards, create more interaction, create more voice to people that don't have it now, and that actually, and still feel in control as a political leader in that way. That would be
great.
I would do my magic wand for that.
Fantastic. And sadly, we are almost out of time. So we've had a very wide-ranging discussion, from Destiny's Child to how to engage stakeholders to money. I think we could probably keep going all afternoon, but it would be great if you could join me in giving a big thank you to our panellists.